Miles Givens had never been one for neighborhoods, regulations, or routine neighborly banter. He liked quiet land and even quieter boundaries. That's why he chose the outskirts of Emory, Colorado, where the town's last paved road faded into dust and scrub, and where a man could live a full day without seeing another soul. His land had once been a horse ranch, complete with a rusted-out stable and a crooked wind vane that still creaked when the wind cut from the west. Most people saw it as a relic, a broken-down patch of nowhere. To Miles, it was the first place that didn't ask anything from him. Just wide, breathing space. The only company he kept was Briggs, a stoic Belgian Malinois with a scar across his muzzle and the kind of gaze that could still a stranger mid-step. Briggs wasn't just any dog. He was a retired explosive detection canine with a past littered with metal fragments and lives saved. Miles had first seen him years ago while volunteering with a canine program. Briggs was already aging out of service, deemed too wary and selective to work with new handlers. That caution, that stubborn loyalty, they were exactly what drew Miles in. He filed the paperwork, paid the absurd transport fees, and brought Briggs home. Since then, they had moved through life like two aging wolves, wary, bonded, and uninterested in small talk. Though the ranch sat outside the town's homeowners association by a few hundred yards, the newly drawn zoning map now looped the HOA boundary awkwardly close to Miles's north fence. No one had bothered to tell him at the time. It wasn't until the day he found a printed community safety reminder zip-tied to his gatepost, complete with rules about fencing aesthetics, loose animals, and noise ordinances, that he realized trouble might be inching closer. It was only a matter of days before she arrived. Karen Delaney stood out like vinyl siding in a canyon. Pearls, lavender perfume, the kind of posture that communicated ownership long before a word was spoken. She came walking down the dusty path in shoes clearly not meant for gravel, holding a clipboard against her chest like it was a legal badge. Miles had just finished hosing down a trough when she called out with a tight smile, "Hello there. I wanted to introduce myself. Karen Delaney, I'm the Community Wellness Liaison with the association." Miles didn't respond right away. He unclipped the hose, set it down, and gave her a polite but unreadable nod. Karen smiled wider, gesturing vaguely toward his land. "We've had a few concerns raised during last week's meeting. Something about an aggressive-looking animal on the premises." He followed her eyes to Briggs, who lay sprawled in the shade of the barn, head resting on his paws, unmoving. Only his ears twitched, tracking the tone in her voice. "He's never left the property," Miles said flatly. "He doesn't bark unless someone's already inside the gate." "Oh, I'm sure he's very well trained," Karen replied quickly, but her eyes were fixed on Briggs like she expected him to leap at her at any moment. "Still, with children in the area now, we want to make sure everything feels safe." The word hung there, passive and sharp. Safe, as if that had ever been the real concern. Karen left with a nod and a smile that didn't reach her eyes, promising a follow-up conversation, just to make sure we're aligned. Briggs didn't move until she was fully out of sight. Then he stood, walked over to the fence where she had passed, and stared long after the dust had settled. Miles said nothing, but he felt something shift under his ribs, something old and familiar, an understanding that people didn't always push with fists or commands. Sometimes they pushed with smiles and meetings and printed notices that looked harmless until they weren't. Miles didn't know it yet, but that visit was the start of a slow, steady unraveling. Not loud, not fast, but deliberate. One rule, one complaint, one misunderstanding at a time. The mornings on the ranch had a rhythm Miles had grown to depend on. Briggs would stir first, pacing the porch once before nudging open the screen door with practiced ease. Miles would already be in the kitchen by then, barefoot, pouring coffee into the metal cup he never washed properly. It wasn't just routine, it was equilibrium. But that rhythm cracked one fog-heavy morning when Briggs refused to come inside. He stood at the edge of the yard, ears sharp, body tense, fixated on a point beyond the fence. At first, Miles thought it was one of the coyotes that sometimes skirted the property at night, but as he stepped outside and followed Briggs' gaze, he noticed a plastic tie dangling from the fence post, the kind used for bundled wires, or, in this case, unauthorized notices. He crossed the gravel and found a laminated sheet clipped to his gate. It bore the HOA's emblem and the header, Second Notice of Non-Compliance. Beneath it, in dense legal language, was an assertion that an animal, of significant size and unknown temperament, had been observed roaming within visible range of the residential loop. The letter included vague references to multiple concerns, and a highlighted line toward the bottom that read, "For the well-being of the greater community, we ask that the animal be secured, relocated, or otherwise removed from proximity to communal boundaries." There was no signature, no name, just a phone number and a reference code. Miles stood there, reading it again and again. The language wasn't accusatory, not directly. It was a suggestion, presented as policy, wrapped in neutral tone, weaponized through formality. Briggs hadn't been outside the fence. There was no report of a bite, no incident, just concerns, just optics. Someone saw a dog lying by a gate and decided that his presence, by itself, was a problem. That day, Miles didn't do the usual chores. He went inside, sat at his desk, and pulled out the box of files he never touched: the discharge papers, the behavioral certification forms for Briggs, the adoption contracts, the municipal registration, the veterinarian records. He printed it all out, hole-punched every sheet, slid it into a binder, and placed it by the door like a shield. He wasn't preparing for a fight. Not yet. But he had learned, in another life, what it meant when people began their assaults through paper. The moment you were on file, you had to be ready to exist entirely in documents. Prove yourself through forms and references, not presence or memory. He wasn't about to lose this fight because he hadn't labeled his world. The following weekend, Karen returned. Not to the gate this time, but across the road, standing behind a neighbor's garden wall with a man in slacks and a fleece vest. Miles saw them as he drove back from town, bags of feed in the back seat, Briggs dozing in the passenger seat like a stone statue. The man looked up, made a note on a clipboard, then nodded as Karen spoke. When their eyes met through the windshield, Miles didn't wave. He didn't stop. He parked, let Briggs out, and watched as the dog wandered to his usual spot near the barn and lay down in the dirt, content. By Tuesday, the letter came. This time it had a name: Elliot Crane, Deputy Operations Officer for the local HOA chapter. The tone was almost friendly, beginning with, "We're grateful for your commitment to maintaining a safe and respectful property." Then the letter pivoted into accusation, masked as collaboration. It claimed a child had been visibly startled by an unleashed canine near the edge of the residential loop. No dates, no witnesses, just an assurance that future escalation can be avoided through simple realignments of access zones and daily routines. Miles was encouraged to schedule a voluntary compliance review. Failure to respond, the letter warned, could result in the initiation of formal citations. He read the letter aloud, once, to Briggs, who thumped his tail at the sound of Miles's voice but otherwise remained unimpressed. Then he folded the paper carefully and slid it into the binder with the rest. It was still manageable. Still paper, still theory. Until the garbage incident. Thursday morning brought the smell first. Acrid, sour, unfamiliar. Miles stepped outside and found his trash cans overturned, their contents half buried in the gravel like someone had kicked them through the yard. It wasn't the mess that bothered him. It was the pattern. The bags weren't torn by animals, not clawed or chewed. They were slashed, cleanly, like with a blade. At the center of the pile lay one of the laminated HOA notices, this one from last week, folded neatly and resting atop the waist like a flag planted in territory. Briggs, unusually alert, refused to leave the porch. He stayed by the steps all morning, eyes trained on the hill. Something in him had shifted, and Miles trusted that more than any letter. That day, he installed a camera under the eave of the barn, pointed toward the fence line. Not for proof, but for clarity. He didn't want to argue. He just wanted to see. The footage captured nothing unusual until midnight. At 12:03 a.m., the edge of the screen flared with light. Headlights. A slow-moving car approached the fence, paused, then reversed without turning around. It never crossed onto his land, never even stopped fully. But someone had come to see, or to be seen. That small action, brief, almost invisible, felt heavier than any formal notice. The next morning, Briggs didn't bark. He didn't eat. He sat near the back shed, unmoving, eyes fixed on the tree line. When Miles finally approached him, the dog whimpered softly and leaned into his leg. Not afraid, but burdened, like he had seen something and didn't know how to respond. That's when Miles noticed the bite mark, small, deep, fresh, on Briggs's foreleg. Not from a fight, not a tear, a puncture. Someone had prodded him, tested something. Miles cleaned the wound, wrapped it, and sat with Briggs in silence for an hour. He didn't call anyone, didn't report anything, but the rhythm of the ranch, the unspoken calm, the expected patterns, had fractured. And Miles knew, with unsettling certainty, that this was no longer about rules, or fences, or the proximity of a dog to someone else's child. This had become something else, something colder, quieter, and far more calculated. The sound that woke Miles was not loud, but it was precise. 3 dull, metallic clangs against the southern gate, each spaced evenly apart, as if struck deliberately and not by accident. It was still dark outside, though the horizon had begun to loosen from the blackness and fade into that soft, pre-dawn gray. Briggs had already risen, his head low and eyes alert, standing by the door without a sound. There was something about the dog's posture that gave Miles pause. Not alarm, not fear, but tension drawn tight like wire. When he stepped out onto the porch, barefoot and shirtless in the chilled morning air, the stillness of the land struck him differently. It didn't feel like solitude anymore. It felt monitored. He found the gate ajar, not forced open, but gently unlatched, the bolt resting against the post in a way that suggested someone had opened it quietly and slipped away. On the dirt path leading toward the shed lay 3 rocks, placed, not scattered, each of them roughly the size of a fist, aligned in a near-perfect triangle. In the center of that triangle was a dog biscuit. Not one Miles had ever bought. Not one Briggs would have eaten. He stood beside it, his tail unmoving, his body rigid. Miles didn't touch it. He fetched a plastic bag, scooped the biscuit inside, and sealed it, then took photos of the rocks and the gate before relatching it with a new lock. Then he walked the perimeter of the property, slowly, methodically, like he used to do in training exercises, marking distance, identifying sight lines, and noting points of exposure. The fence had no breaches. The brush hadn't been disturbed. Whoever had come did so quietly and left without a mark, except for the message left behind. They could enter, any time, without resistance. By the time he made it back to the house, Briggs was pacing, something the dog rarely did. Miles gave him a command to sit. He obeyed, but remained restless, glancing back toward the gate again and again. The ranch no longer felt like a home. It felt like a place someone else had decided was vulnerable. Later that day, he took the biscuit to a veterinarian clinic 15 miles north, one that specialized in toxicology. The receptionist, used to frantic pet owners with emergencies, gave him a confused look when he calmly handed over the sealed bag and asked for an analysis. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. By the time he returned home, the voicemail was already waiting for him. The biscuit had tested positive for xylitol, a sugar substitute lethal to dogs in small doses. Whoever left it hadn't just been trespassing. They'd tried to kill Briggs. But not recklessly, not in a rage. This was meticulous. That evening, Miles sat at his kitchen table with the lights off. Outside, the crickets had returned, and the usual sounds of dusk filled the air, but something in him refused to accept the illusion of calm. He wasn't a man prone to dramatics, but he knew patterns. He knew escalation. And this was the quiet turning point between subtle pressure and something more dangerous. 2 days later, he found the flyer. It had been slipped under the windshield wiper of his truck while he was inside the hardware store, a place he visited weekly where everyone nodded but never spoke too long. The flyer wasn't handwritten. It was professionally printed on glossy paper, formatted like a community safety bulletin. The header read, "Do you know what's living next door to you?" Underneath, in bullet points, were phrases like unregulated animal training, suspected aggression history, non-compliant property structures, and lack of verified licensing. There was no mention of Briggs by name, no mention of Miles. But the photo, blurry, zoomed in, taken from a distance, showed Briggs lying beside the barn, his face turned away from the lens. There was only one place that image could have been taken from, the ridge on the west side of the property just beyond the barbed wire. Miles crumpled the paper slowly and placed it in his coat pocket. He said nothing to the cashier. He said nothing to the man who had watched him from the garden aisle but quickly turned when their eyes met. He drove home without music, parked, and locked the truck. Then he walked the entire western ridge until the sun began to fall. He found nothing. No footprints, no trail cams, no wrappers or tire marks. Whoever was watching him knew how to disappear. The next morning, the phone call came. The number was local, unlisted. A woman's voice, unmistakably Karen's though she didn't give her name, opened with pleasantries that quickly folded into concern. She hoped Miles would consider attending the upcoming HOA safety review forum and acknowledge that emotions were running high regarding community stability. Then came the pivot. "We've had several anonymous reports involving your property and certain activities happening late at night." The pause that followed wasn't empty. It was calculated. "We just want to ensure that everyone remains safe, that no one feels cornered." Miles didn't respond. He let the silence stretch long enough for her to end the call herself, which she did, with a cheery, brittle goodbye. That night, Briggs barked for the first time in weeks. Short, sharp, insistent. Miles opened the door and saw his dog standing at the base of the hill, growling toward the edge of the property. He followed, flashlight in hand, heart low in his chest. At the far end of the fence, dangling from the wire like bait, hung a strip of cloth, khaki-colored, frayed at the edge, reeking of some artificial musk. Briggs wouldn't go near it. Miles cut it free with a knife and carried it back inside, gloves on, stomach turning. It wasn't just provocation anymore. It was testing, conditioning, a series of carefully orchestrated triggers designed to elicit a response. And it was working. Briggs was more alert, more reactive, and Miles himself had begun waking up multiple times a night, every creak of the barn or shift of the wind setting his nerves on edge. He wasn't afraid, not exactly, but the ground beneath him no longer felt stable. There were no direct threats, no formal charges, just encroachment, just presence, just the feeling of being studied by people who believed they could shape the truth by surrounding it with innuendo and silence. He didn't know their next move, but he knew his. It began with the sound of metal, faint, hollow, distant, like something being dragged across a surface too smooth to hold it. Miles had long since stopped expecting sleep to be uninterrupted, but this sound was different. It wasn't close enough to trigger the motion lights nor urgent enough to spark panic. It was steady, persistent, almost patient. Briggs was already awake, body stiff beside the door, ears back, eyes narrow. He didn't bark. He didn't even move. Miles slid on his boots, not bothering with the shirt, and stepped outside with the flashlight in one hand and the old .22 in the other. The night was cold, the air thick with a pre-storm pressure that made his lungs feel heavier than usual. The barn, the trough, the yard. Nothing moved. But the sound was still there, muffled now coming from the rear of the tool shed, where the dirt met the concrete slab that ran beneath the storage structure. He moved without noise, sweeping the light slowly until it landed on the source. A box, dark and rectangular, wedged beneath the lip of the slab. The dragging sound had stopped. In its place, an intermittent pulse, an electronic clicking, too fast to be random. Briggs didn't approach. He crouched low, whining in his throat but refusing to step closer, which was the only reason Miles didn't reach for the box. Instead, he circled it, watching for wires, for antennae, for anything that hinted at what it was. From one side, he could just make out the faint impression of mesh speaker holes. It wasn't a trap. It was a transmitter. He didn't touch it that night. He made Briggs stay inside and waited until morning before removing it with gloves and placing it in a metal bucket. With the flashlight trained inside, he found what he suspected: an SD slot, 2 cracked solder joints, and a patch of discolored metal near the power jack. The box wasn't new. It had been cobbled together from scraps, hastily but deliberately. He opened it on the workbench, carefully pulling out the chip and sliding it into an old laptop he only used offline. The files were labeled in a format he recognized from his years of consulting: date, time, length, size. Audio files. 36 of them, each no more than 2 minutes long. He clicked the first. It was ambient noise, static and wind, and a low hum he recognized as the old generator kicking on behind the barn. The second file was almost identical. The third had his voice in it, faint, muffled, but unmistakable. He was giving Briggs a command to stay. Another file. Briggs growling. Another. The sound of the gate swinging open, followed by silence. He listened to all 36. What he heard was a manufactured narrative. Carefully selected snippets of harmless moments reframed to sound sinister. Without context, they could be used to argue almost anything. That he was training the dog for aggression, that Briggs reacted to unknown stimuli in unpredictable ways, that there were periods of nocturnal activity inconsistent with rural residency. In isolation, they were meaningless, but stitched together by someone with motive, they became ammunition. Not for legal use, no, but for social pressure, for justification, for quiet consensus. It wasn't surveillance. It was scripting. Miles sat there long after the last file played, staring at the waveform on the screen. He'd encountered tactics like this before. People reshaping reality in pieces, weaponizing suggestion without ever drawing blood. He didn't know who had placed the device, but he no longer cared to guess. The HOA didn't need to approve such actions. They just had to look away when someone else did it for them. The next afternoon, a man named Russell came by. Miles knew of him. Retired linesman, lived on the HOA side, 3 houses down from Karen. They'd exchanged a few words over the years, always civil, never deep. Russell parked his truck halfway up the road and walked the rest, hands in his coat pockets, eyes down. "I'm not here to cause anything," he said as soon as he stepped past the mailbox. Miles said nothing, just nodded for him to go on. "They're putting something together," Russell said after a moment. "Karen's been collecting statements, talking to people who've only seen your place from across the fence. Claims your dog's unstable. Claims you've been storing something." He paused. "Didn't say what. Just that it's not safe for community standards. I figured you'd want to know." Miles exhaled slowly. "Why are you telling me?" Russell looked ashamed. "Because they asked me to sign it, too. I said no. Didn't feel right. But not everyone's saying no." Later that week, Briggs disappeared. It happened between 3 and 5 in the morning. Miles had checked the yard at 2:45, saw him curled near the porch. By the time the sun rose, the gate was closed, and Briggs was gone. No blood, no drag marks, no sound. Just absence. Miles searched the ridge first, then the ravine. He drove the fence line twice, walked it once, called every local vet, every shelter, every rescue center. No one had seen him. By noon, the panic had receded into a kind of hollow efficiency. Miles printed flyers, stapled them across town, posted notices at gas stations, handed them out to clerks. He didn't eat. He didn't sleep. On the second day, he drove to the edge of a nearby lake where kids sometimes took stray animals and left them. Nothing. On the third day, he got a call from the woman who ran the feed store. "Someone saw a dog near the old coal bridge," she said. "Might be him." Miles was in the truck before she finished the sentence. He drove faster than he should have, skidding onto the gravel path near the bridge. And there, at the far end of the ravine, he saw a figure. Briggs, covered in mud, limping but alive. The dog didn't bark. He just wagged once, then collapsed. Miles ran the rest of the way, lifted him, and carried him into the cab. Back home, the vet confirmed what Miles suspected: mild dehydration, a laceration on the rear leg, and sedative residue in his bloodstream. Someone had taken him. Someone had dumped him. But they hadn't hurt him beyond that. They hadn't needed to. When Miles returned, a fresh letter was waiting at the gate. It bore the HOA's seal, printed on heavy paper, delivered by hand. This time, there was no mention of concerns or suggestions. This letter declared that due to a documented history of public safety issues involving an animal under your control, the HOA would be recommending a petition to rezone the boundary lines of the neighborhood, bringing his parcel under regulatory jurisdiction. The vote would be held in 2 weeks. Miles didn't read the rest. He burned the letter in a coffee can by the porch while Briggs slept in the shade, the bandage on his leg bright against his coat. It was no longer a dispute. It was a siege. And now they were playing for territory. The vote was never meant to be about governance. That much became clear as soon as the first flyers began circulating in mailboxes across the HOA's jurisdiction. They weren't official notices. They carried no association seal, no signatures from board members. Instead, they were anonymous, unaddressed, and inflammatory, printed on thin stock with bolded phrases like "danger just beyond the fence," "unregulated dog facility threatens community harmony," and "pet or weapon." Alongside the copy were blurred images of Briggs, taken at strange angles with distorted contrast, his eyes catching light in a way that made him look feral, unnatural, even threatening. The implication was unambiguous. Briggs was not just an animal but a problem, and Miles was the cause. At first, Miles had hoped to ignore them, to treat them like the rest of the silent warfare he had grown accustomed to: trespasses without fingerprints, complaints without names. But the flyers were only the beginning. Next came the shift in the road traffic. Cars that used to pass his property quickly now slowed to a crawl, lingering at the curve near his gate, some even rolling down windows to peer through the fence. More than once, Miles caught flashes, small, deliberate flickers of phones being raised and lowered. No direct confrontation, no questions, just quiet documentation. Then came the drone. It appeared at dusk, just above the tree line, drifting like a dandelion seed in reverse. Briggs barked first, a short burst of sound that sent Miles running from the barn, his sleeves still rolled. He saw it hovering about 20 feet above the yard, blinking softly, rotating with clinical precision as it moved slowly along the perimeter. Briggs barked again, more insistent now, circling under the drone, then stopping and growling with his head low and body rigid. Miles picked up a rock and hurled it. The drone jolted upward, wobbled, and retreated into the trees without sound. He didn't follow it. He already knew it would lead nowhere. That night, he installed new motion lights along the west side of the property. He moved Briggs's bed closer to the porch. He locked the gates with heavier chains. He didn't bother calling the sheriff. He knew what the response would be, a polite note that airspace violations were difficult to trace, and no real laws had been broken unless it entered his home. Drones had become tools of convenience, used for lawn inspections and real estate flyovers. But this wasn't inspection. It was surveillance dressed as casual curiosity. Within days, the vote was announced via a letter left in his mailbox. Not delivered, but placed by hand, as always. The HOA would be holding an open discussion regarding potential community boundary alignment due to recent safety incidents and civic sentiment. The language was careful, sterile, but the intention bled through. They wanted control, and they intended to frame it as consensus. Miles didn't plan to attend. He had no intention of legitimizing a process that had already been corrupted by narrative. But on the morning of the vote, something changed. He received a visit from a young couple, Jack and Marla, who lived on the far end of the HOA boundary, a good 5-minute drive from his property. They stood awkwardly by the fence, holding their toddler, asking if they could speak to him. They weren't hostile. In fact, they looked uncomfortable, apologetic even. "We're not here to accuse you of anything," Jack began. We got a letter saying we had the right to petition for animal control to remove the dog if we felt unsafe." Miles blinked. "You ever feel unsafe here?" Jack hesitated. "Number. But they sent photos, and honestly, we don't know what to believe." "They?" Miles asked, but the question was rhetorical. He already knew. Marla stepped forward slightly, her voice low. "We just wanted to see you. The way this is being handled. It doesn't feel right. We don't want to sign anything, but we're being told if we don't, it'll be interpreted as community indifference, that they'll act on the majority." Miles nodded once. He thanked them, watched them leave, then walked back into the house where Briggs was asleep with his muzzle tucked under his paw. That evening, the lights cut out. Not just the porch lights or the barn floodlight. All of it. The motion lights he'd installed days earlier. The path lights by the side gate. The sensor-activated bulbs near the fence line. At first, he thought it was a blown transformer, but the main house still had power. He checked the junction box. Clean. Untouched. But the cables running along the perimeter wall had been sliced, neatly, precisely in the places furthest from view. He replaced what he could by flashlight. Briggs never left his side, tail stiff, body moving in slow, suspicious arcs. It wasn't fear. It was discipline. Learned, instinctive. Someone had been on the property again, not just to damage but to demonstrate reach. 2 days later, he discovered the sign. It was nailed to a tree just beyond the property line, angled so it could be seen only when exiting the ranch. It was made of cheap plastic, the kind used for political ads or garage sales, but its message was printed with professional clarity. Caution, potentially aggressive animal ahead. It bore no attribution, no logo, no HOA signature, just the suggestion placed in the eye line of passers-by. That night, Miles sat on the porch with Briggs lying beside him, both of them watching the horizon without speaking. The wind had shifted. A storm was brewing somewhere to the west. The air smelled like static and dry cedar. Miles didn't move for a long time. He simply sat there, tracing the shape of the sign in his mind, imagining the moment someone had crept up and hammered it in, confident that no one would question it, that the story they'd crafted had taken root deep enough for symbols to do the rest of the work. He wasn't worried about his land, not yet. What gnawed at him was the creeping suspicion that the people behind these acts, whoever they were, weren't seeking resolution. They didn't want Briggs relocated or Miles evicted. They wanted something else: submission, a surrender of presence, a quiet compliance achieved not through force, but exhaustion. And exhaustion, he realized, was beginning to settle in. Not physical, psychological. But Miles had seen longer campaigns. He had known slower enemies. He'd survived them by learning how to wait longer than they could plan. So he waited. But this time, not just with patience, he waited with intention. Because something in the way the sign had been worded, in the way the drone had hovered, in the way the wires had been cut, told him that the next act wouldn't be noise. It would be precision. It would be legal, documented, framed through the system they'd twisted into shape, and he intended to be ready. The meeting was held in the community center, a low stucco building at the edge of the HOA's official boundary, with its fluorescent lights humming faintly and its folding chairs arranged in neat rows facing a podium that looked more ceremonial than functional. Miles had no intention of speaking, yet when he entered with Briggs at his side, on leash, calm, steady, and silent, the entire room shifted. Conversation stopped. A few people looked away as if embarrassed to be caught staring. Others leaned forward, and Karen Delaney, seated front and center, smiled with the deliberate poise of someone already rehearsing her victory. On the table in front of her were papers stacked so neatly that the symmetry itself felt like accusation. She tapped them once with a pen, a sound more piercing than the hum of the lights. Elliot Crane, the so-called operations officer, began the proceedings with a formal tone, reading from a script about community well-being and the importance of mutual trust. His words droned on, but the audience wasn't listening to him. Their attention was drawn toward Briggs, who sat perfectly still beside Miles, ears alert but body relaxed, his presence quiet yet undeniable. When Karen was called to speak, she stood with a grace meant to project calm authority, but her voice betrayed something sharper, a practiced conviction straining under the weight of her own obsession. She spoke of unresolved threats, of neighbors living in fear, of a pattern of disturbances linked directly to Miles and his dog. She referred to recordings, to statements, to incidents that no one in the room could actually place, yet her words rolled out with the precision of a verdict. When she finished, the room was silent, not in agreement, but in discomfort. Elliot asked if there were any counterstatements, and before Miles could decide whether to rise, a voice from the back interrupted. It was Russell, the retired linesman, standing with both hands on the back of a chair. His voice was calm, deliberate. "I've lived here 20 years. I've walked past his fence 100 times. That dog has never left the yard. That dog has never so much as barked unless someone went near the gate at night. If you're afraid of him, maybe it's because you've been looking for something to fear." A ripple passed through the room, not applause, not support, but a break in the script Karen had been weaving. Other voices followed, quiet at first, then more assured. Jack and Marla spoke next, recounting how Briggs had sniffed their toddler's hand through the fence and wagged his tail. A woman from the far cul-de-sac admitted she had signed a statement without reading it fully, pressured by the promise that it was only a precaution. Karen's composure faltered, but only slightly. She reached for her papers, fumbling through them before producing photographs. Grainy, dark, showing Briggs mid-bark, teeth visible, eyes glowing from the camera flash. She held them high like evidence in a trial, but the effect was not what she expected. Miles rose slowly, walked to the podium with Briggs at his side, and said nothing. Instead, he placed a different set of papers on the table. Official documents. Briggs's service records, certifications, commendations, veterinary files, all stamped, signed and verifiable. He didn't embellish. He didn't argue. He let the weight of fact sit in the air against the fragility of rumor. Then, with one simple gesture, he commanded Briggs to sit and stay. The dog obeyed instantly, lowering into place at the foot of the podium. Miles stepped back 3 paces, then 5. Briggs did not move. He waited, eyes fixed, posture calm, a living contradiction to every word that had painted him as wild or uncontrollable. The silence in the room stretched longer than anyone expected, until even Elliot looked uncertain. Finally, Miles spoke, his voice low but steady. "This dog saved lives before he ever set foot on this land. He doesn't know politics and he doesn't know grudges. He only knows loyalty. If you want to call that dangerous, that's on you." The moment broke whatever illusion had been holding the crowd in place. Murmurs filled the room, not of agreement with Karen, but of unease with the campaign she had orchestrated. Elliot shifted in his seat, clearly uncomfortable before announcing that the vote would be postponed pending further review. Karen tried to protest, waving her photos in the air, but her voice cracked, and the sound rang false. Her certainty had dissolved in the face of something too visible to deny. As Miles left the building, Briggs walking steady beside him, he didn't look back at the room. He didn't need to. He could feel the change in the air, the fracture in the narrative Karen had built so carefully. She had underestimated not just him, but the quiet persistence of truth when it finally found a stage. Outside, the night was cool, the wind sharp, carrying the scent of pine down from the ridge. Briggs lifted his head to it, ears high, body strong despite the scar still healing on his leg. For the first time in weeks, Miles allowed himself to breathe fully, not with relief, but with clarity. The siege was not over, but the illusion had broken, and illusions once broken are harder to rebuild than fences. The weeks after the meeting passed more quietly than Miles had expected, though the quiet was not the same as before. It was no longer the unbothered calm of a man living at the edge of town, but a watchful stillness, the kind that follows a storm when the air feels cleaner, yet the ground is still damp with memory. Briggs recovered steadily, his limp fading, his appetite returning, until he was once again the shadow at Miles's side, present in every step of the routine they had built together. No more flyers appeared, no more drones hovered, and no more letters were fastened to the gate. Karen stopped attending the HOA gatherings altogether, her name mentioned only in hushed tones by those who now recognized how far she had carried her fear into obsession. There was no formal announcement of her resignation, no public acknowledgement of wrongdoing. She simply receded, her influence dissolving like smoke into the sky. For Miles, victory did not feel triumphant. It felt functional. His land remained his, Briggs remained by his side, and the weight pressing on the days finally lifted. Yet beneath that relief was a harder truth he could not ignore. Once a community has been taught to suspect, suspicion lingers even after evidence collapses. He knew there would always be eyes that lingered a little too long when he passed through town, always whispers when Briggs' name was mentioned, but that was a burden he could carry, because unlike rumors, loyalty did not fracture. One evening, as the sun settled low and burned the horizon orange, a knock came at his door. It was Russell again, holding nothing but a folded sheet of paper, an invitation from a local school district asking if Miles might consider demonstrating Briggs's training to their emergency response volunteers. Russell shrugged as he handed it over, saying only, "They want to see what a real working dog looks like." Miles read the letter once, then set it on the table. Briggs looked up at him, ears pricked as if waiting for a command. Miles gave none. He only rested a hand on the dog's head, feeling the steady warmth of something that neither votes nor boundaries could ever strip away. And for the first time in a long while, he allowed himself the rare comfort of believing that the fight was not just survival but preservation of something unshakably his.